having. Is the connection working?
You were on this plane, exactly, but because we were in the different, we were in but it was crazy. But I don't know because some people were accepted for this plane and some no. Yes. Yes, that was happened also to me once when I wanted to arrive. And they know, the plane is here, please. Yes, that's how. Is it on? Ethiopia. Ah, yeah.
Is-
So good morning, dear colleagues, dear friends. I think that we can start. So dear colleagues, good morning and welcome to this constitutive meeting of the Caribbean EU Parliamentary Assembly. Before we start, I would like to inform you that we have the following language regime for this meeting: German, English, French, Portuguese and Polish. You may also speak in Spanish and Italian, but there will be no interpretation into those languages. I am Marian Jean Marinescu. I am Vice President of the Caribbean EU Assembly from the EU side, and in the absence of our co-president, Mrs. Wisniewska, I will co-chair this meeting. I will allow my colleague, co-president from OACPS side, to introduce himself. Please.
Thank you. Good morning, colleagues. My name is Honorable Leroy Clark, Member of Parliament, Deputy Speaker of the House of Jamaica Parliament, and I'm your co-president for the Caribbean EU Regional Parliamentary Assembly. I look forward to working with my colleague from the EU side and with all of you.
Yes, thank you very much. So before we adopt the draft agenda, let me give you a brief overview of the session. We will start by adopting our rules of procedure that we have prepared over the last 2 years. After that, we will continue with the keynote debate on the theme, A New Dawn in OACPS-EU Relations, Perspectives of the Caribbean EU Regional Parliamentary Assembly, which is part of our overall theme towards a people-led partnership. To start of the keynote debate, we will have a virtual presentation on the topic, climate finance. For this, we have invited Mrs. Pep Bardwell from the Bridgetown Initiative as speaker. She will join us remotely. Members of the Assembly are also invited to speak on their expectations of the new OACPS-EU Partnership Agreement, Samoa Agreement, outlining the issues of interest for the Caribbean region while expanding on what a people-led partnership means to them. So the key debate can be broader than the issue of climate finance. Under our last agenda item, you will also have the possibility to raise other issues under any other business. Please, Mr. Clark.
Honorable members, as you're aware, the primary mandate of any parliamentary assembly is to exercise its consultative and oversight role over the executive. This function is no different from our regional and joint parliamentary assemblies. Under the Samoa Agreement, our mandate as outlined in Article 94, subsection 3, subsection B of the Samoa's Agreement is to promote democratic processes through dialogue and consultation and facilitate greater understanding between the people of the EU and the people of the OACPS. Resultantly, as parliamentarians, we are called upon in this first meeting to speak on the issues that are of interest to our people and which can be achieved through the implementation of the Samoa Agreement. Your submission during the debate today will be added to the list of topics that will be the focus of our Assembly's work in the future. I thank you all.
Thank you, Honorable Clark. So, as I said before, under our last agenda item, you will also have the possibility to raise other issues under any other business. So, can we adopt the agenda as proposed? If there are no comments, I thank you. The agenda is adopted, and next point on the agenda is adoption of the rules of procedures. So the new Samoa Agreement, which replaced the Cotonou Agreement at the beginning of the year, has brought changes to the parliamentary dimension of our cooperation. With the Samoa Agreement, we now have a new joint parliamentary assembly that will meet once a year, and we also have 3 regional assemblies, one of each is our Caribbean EU Parliamentary Assembly. Since these assemblies are formally new ones, we have to adopt the rules of procedure. As a reminder, the work to prepare the rules of procedure began already in 2021 when the GPA Bureau decided to set up a drafting committee. This drafting committee was charged with preparing new draft rules and met 12 times to discuss them. The proposals and the outcome of the work were discussed in the JPAs in Strasbourg and in Mozambique. During the JPA in Brussels in June last year, they were endorsed by a vote. To be formally and legally correct, we, as a new parliamentary assembly under the Samoa Agreement, will now have to adopt our rules of procedures. Given these preceding and exhaustive processes, the rules will today be formally adopted. And of course, I propose you to adopt this by acclamation. Thank you very much. Thank you, colleagues. Our new rules of procedure are hereby adopted, and I am pleased to say that the Caribbean EU Parliamentary Assembly is now the second institution under the Samoa Agreement to be ready to start working after our Pacific friends did the same this morning. So now, Mr. Clark, you have the floor.
Thank you. Number 3, keynote debate towards a people-led partnership, perspectives of the Caribbean EU Regional Parliamentary Assembly. Dear colleagues, the global climate crisis is threatening our planet's ecosystem, economies, and the resilience of our society. As elected members of Parliament, we must tackle this crisis and do our utmost for the future generations. The Bridgetown Agreement, forged through collaborations and solidarity amongst nations, represents one way forward in our effort to combat climate change. This agreement embodies the recognition that addressing the climate crisis requires not only bold ambition, but also tangible financial resources to support mitigation, adaptation, and resilient building initiative. We must translate our commitment into action, mobilizing resources at scale and with speed. This requires innovative financing mechanisms, robust partnership between governments, the private sector, civil society, and local communities, and a steadfast dedication to transparency and accountability. Through the Samoa Agreement, our countries reiterated their commitment to fostering human and social development, eradicating poverty, and fighting discrimination and equality, leaving no one behind. The focus of this partnership, therefore, is human development. For our Caribbean region, we shall also listen to the expressions of our expectations of the agreement and how we, as parliamentarians, with oversight on the implementation process, we can ensure that critical development challenges are addressed for our people. The issues that you highlight during the debate shall be added to the list of issues that will be the basis of the work of our Caribbean EU Regional Parliamentary Assembly in the future. I am very happy that I can welcome our external speaker today, Dr. Pekuke Bardubel. You have the floor, Doctor.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right?
Are we hearing? Just indicate by maybe a little bit on the volume.
Hello, good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we are hearing you, madam.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. I don't know if there is live translation. I also don't know if I'm on a screen, but please do let me know if there are issues with either the visuals or with the speed of my talking for the translators.
So you're on screen. You're on quite a number of big, large screens. And I do believe that the language is being interpreted. So you're free to go.
Thank you so much. Well, it's certainly a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much indeed for the opportunity. Mr. Speaker has already, Mr. Clark has already indicated a little bit about the Bridgetown Initiative. And the focus of my intervention will be twofold. Firstly, to provide an overview of Bridgetown, and secondly, from the perspective of areas in which parliamentarians can support the important work of the global as well as national climate and development finance architecture, I will suggest some pointers. Firstly, the Bridgetown Initiative covers 5 key areas that are critical to changing the way that global development and climate finance operate. The first looks at the debt equation. The reality is that most of the countries that are struggling the most with climate change, which is easily about a third of the countries in the world, are also struggling with debt. The reality is that at least half of those countries are amongst the poorest in the world and are doing their very best to meet sustainable development goals. The sustainable development goals, as we all know, cover basic services from health to education, water, sanitation, energy. And many countries, many governments have had over the years to borrow significant amounts of money from both bilateral and multilateral partners in order to meet the needs of their populations. When we add to the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals, with the critical importance of climate change, which has only become harder and harder for many countries to grapple with, we're seeing debt burdens climb. As an example, I am from Dominica. Dominica was hit by a Category 5 hurricane in 2017, which resulted in over 200% of loss and damage in GDP of loss and damage. Overnight, 200% of the country's gross domestic product was impacted. A country that has that type of impact will need to borrow its way to recovery. But in many countries, you don't have such acute crises. You have slow onset climate change. You have depletion of water resources as rainfall patterns change. You have populations that are moving from one part of the country to the other in order to grow food. Right? You have damage to infrastructure from storms that are not considered a Category 5 hurricane, but that affect power lines or affect water intake valves. And so the slow onset climate change, coupled with acute events, makes it very difficult for governments to stay on top of their borrowing. So debt is a key area, and making sure that debt is sustainable and the debt sustainability analysis of international institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which determines how much money countries can borrow over a period of time, ensuring that that debt sustainability analysis reflects the need for governments to have access to more, cheaper, and longer-term financing, not only to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, but to come out of the climate challenge by building resilience is a critical area. The second area that's key relates to the involvement of the private sector. We need approximately $5 trillion a year to make sure that the climate and development goals that we're all striving for are attained. Currently, there's a financing gap of about $3 trillion annually. This is unfortunate because, particularly in the area of climate change mitigation, we know what technologies can solve our problems. We know that geothermal energy, sustainable hydro energy, wind and solar power are all excellent sources of renewable technology. But in many of our countries, particularly the small island developing states or the smaller nations, it is very challenging to attract the private investment needed, either from domestic or international resources. And one of the reasons is that these markets are perceived to be too small, but the other is that they're perceived to be too risky. Too risky because from a legal and regulatory perspective, perhaps we have not instituted the necessary frameworks, be that public-private partnership agreements or independent power producer frameworks that allow the power sector partners, independent power producers and private players to come to the market and benefit from the opportunity to serve the population at an affordable rate. That means that we're not able to attract the capital. But there's an additional challenge, which is the cost of capital. The risk perception criteria that are used by development partners, that are used by banks for projects in this space, not to mention projects related to climate change adaptation, mean that the cost of capital is often extremely high and therefore prohibitive. We are not able to get the investment that we need, even if the projects are there, simply because it's too expensive. And the populations that would be paying for electricity or paying for water are simply not able to. And therefore, the potential to bring the private sector to the table is constrained by both the affordability of capital as well as the interest of development project developers in our markets. So we need to address this with real urgency. So that relates to climate change mitigation as well as adaptation. We have spoken at length during the COP28 process about the need for further support to the Loss and Damage Fund. The countries that suffer the most from climate change need access to resources that will help them get back on their feet. So urgent attention is needed to provide resources, be it from additional subsidies from G20 governments, be it from levies and taxes on certain polluting sectors, into a fund that allows countries relief. A further area that is absolutely critical is a fundamental reform of the trade system. Trade coexists with international development lending and international support. If countries are not able to export their goods and services in a manner that supports the development of their economies, we will, or they will, continue to be dependent on overseas development assistance to meet their needs. And therefore, a significant reform in trade rules that allow, for example, for domestic value addition in countries not to suffer punitive measures, whereas exporting of raw materials often benefits from favorable measures. So trade is critical. There are other areas within the trade system that need to be looked at going forward. One relates in particular to the European Union, to the CBAM, or the cross-border mechanism for carbon taxation. If the least developed countries are subject to measures under CBAM, which mean that they are disproportionately affected, that means that they're further going to suffer from some of the challenges that we spoke about earlier. So ensuring that the United States Inflation Reduction Act, the European Union CBAM program do not disproportionately affect developing countries is critical. Fourth area relates to overseas development assistance. The World Bank Group is currently in the process of replenishing IDEM, the International Development Assistance Program for the least developed countries, and struggling, to be very honest, to raise the resources necessary to replenish IDEM. This is a critical area because Bridgetown is not just about climate change, as I mentioned from the very onset. It's about achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. IDA, or the International Development Assistance window of the World Bank, remains the largest and most efficient mechanism for crowding in capital for these critical needs. And the reason is that IDA can leverage between 4 and 7-fold the international markets. So for every dollar that's invested in IDA, IDA can raise $4 on the international markets. When we add to that the ability for IDA to invest in climate resilience, $1 invested in IDA can result in $7 in benefit in a government that receives IDA resources. And therefore, replenishing IDA is another critical area that Bridgetown is focusing on. And the final area is the overall reform of the global finance institutions, governance structures, the incentive structures within the institutions, voting rights. These are areas that need to be addressed critically. The World Bank and the international development institutions were constituted many decades ago at a time when the world had certain needs. I think we all understand that things have changed significantly over the past few decades. In particular, climate change has accelerated at an alarming rate over the past 2 decades alone since the turn of the century. The result of all of this combined, the Sustainable Development Goals, climate change, and many of the other crises that are certainly not of the making of developing nations, be those conflicts around the world that are affecting food prices, or the COVID pandemic, which has had a tremendous impact, particularly on Caribbean countries and other countries around the world that are dependent on tourism, has meant that we are dealing with a series of challenges that institutions now need to recognize are the way of the future, and adjusting to provide the resources for countries to dig their way out of these troubles and become more resilient, both socially, economically, and to climate change, will not be an option for us to ignore. So I will pause there. I realize that this intervention has been quite lengthy and covered a number of topics, but the key takeaway is that we're addressing poverty, sustainable development, and climate change together, because there cannot be a bifurcation between these issues. They're intimately linked. And without financing and without a trade system that deals with them structurally, we will not be able to achieve the goals that we're all striving for. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, for that very interesting overview of the situation. I will now open the debate for our members. If you have any question to Dr. Bordelli, we will be given time at the end of the debate to answer these questions. We have "17 persons who would want to debate on this matter. So the floor is now open to our members. First person is Barbados.
Thank you, President, Co-President. Doctor, you are, of course, based in Washington, and you're obviously extremely versed and knowledgeable in terms of the international financial system, which is the last of the 5 points that you raised, which comprise the Barbados Initiative, which of course came out of my country and my Prime Minister, the Honorable Mia Mottley. And tied into that, of course, is the need for fundamental reform as well of the trading system. Trade and finance all linked together. My question to you, as it always is in these fora, is we all recognize, as you have correctly stated, the need to have reform and the adverse effects that the present system, which has been set up since post-World War, 75 plus years ago, when all of our ACP countries were still colonies of European countries and United Kingdom, and we therefore had no say in the formation of Bretton Woods. How challenging or how practical or how realistic is it for us to expect that the United States first and the 5 superpowers which constitute the Security Council of the United Nations, plus the European Union countries, of which a European is always the managing director of the IMF, which is one of the major money lenders of our countries. How practical and realistic is it to expect that these countries will give up the power that they have had from time immemorial, but of course more recently for the last 3/4 of a century since the formation of Bretton Woods, that they're going to give up their power and authority internationally in the United Nations, the World Bank, and the IMF to cede ground to us for reform of these institutions, which we all, certainly within the ACP, recognize is necessary. Thank you.
Doctor?
Thank you. I'm sorry. I thought we were collecting a few questions. Thank you so much, Honorable Hinkman, for your point. I think that no one, rarely does anyone want to give up power voluntarily. That is just the way of the world. But in the absence of, what's the correct word? Realization that things have changed, we maintain the status quo. Often with greater information and greater realization that the world does not look the way it did some time ago, there is also an understanding that the world cannot continue to be run in the way that we had once or have in the past. I think expecting that things will change on their own without pressure, without agitation, perhaps is the right word. Prime Minister, the Honourable Mia Moore-Martley, is also the leader to whom I report as I sit within her office. And I would argue that the Prime Minister, together with many other leaders, be that President Ruto of Kenya, or President Lula of Brazil, who are all advocating for similar changes. Perhaps the details are not identical, but the changes are very similar, are all part and parcel of a movement that is building, that's growing. And that movement is not just of global leaders from the official space, from governments, it's also from civil society. And when you see the mounting movement, it's very difficult to step away and say, no, we're going to ignore. And so the key piece is not only to be an optimist, but to be an agitator, and to agitate through different fora, to agitate by providing data, by providing numbers, to agitate by showing that if things don't change, then there will be implications. If we're not able to reform the global financial architecture for climate and development, there will be an increase not only in deaths and in suffering, but in refugees, right? There will be an increase in the need for support to developing countries down the line. So if we're not able to prevent climate disasters, then we will need to pay for recovery of those climate disasters. And so I would say that it is not easy, and you ask an excellent question, but it is possible, it is necessary, and frankly, there's no alternative. Having spent time in Washington, I see that there's an appetite to listen, and I see that there's a willingness to make adjustments. We've already enjoyed some progress through the Bridgetown Initiative, and many other initiatives are seeing progress. They're perhaps in smaller areas, they're perhaps not in large statements that our institutions have reformed completely. But I do believe that with the right leadership in those institutions, and I'm hopeful that under the leadership of World Bank President Ajay Banga, that type of reform will be achieved.
So thank you, Doc. In the interest of time, what we'll do, we'll have a number of speakers asking their questions, and then we'll send forward to Doctor and take the rest. All right, so at this time, we will be having from the EP, Mr. Marian Jean Marinesco.
Thank you, Chair. And Dr. Bardui, thank you very much for your presentation, and also thank you for the first question asked by Mr. Hinkson. So we are speaking, the theme of our debate is people-led partnership between our regions. And I think that this is an important aspect of our cooperation, because without this cooperation, especially the topic that Dr. opened, the climate change and all the measures that we have to take to mitigate this, will not be possible, because this is a global thing. So everybody on the globe should contribute if we want to have a positive result. And you are far away there, but I think that you have a lot of ties with EU, with EU members, and also with UK, with Europe in generally. So we have to keep these connections, and we have to try to have benefit on both parties from this cooperation. Now I think that all of us, we have two challenges. One is to find the balance between the necessity to reduce emissions and the necessity to have competitiveness, because I don't see any differences between have troubles because of emissions or have troubles because you don't have something to eat. There are the same troubles. At the end, maybe you can even disappear. Yeah? So we have to find this balance. And second challenge, and Doctor presented some of it, is the finance of these measures, because I think that we need a lot of investment in order to put in place, for example, the European Green Deal, and also to put in place all the other measures. So you mentioned, Doctor, something about 5 trillion. Now in EU started to be counted each euro for the future, and they started to say that will be necessary 1 trillion per year in EU. I think is not enough, but this is the number that it's advanced up to now. And I can tell you that the EU budget for 7 years is 1 trillion. So of course, you cannot base only on EU financing, but you have to base also on national financing, but it will be necessary a lot of money to do it. In the same time, as you mentioned, there are some laws, proposals that will have a global impact, like CBAM, as you mentioned, like due diligence, also deforestation, which is valid for also for Africa and for other regions. So we have to take care also about this, because we try to protect the EU, but in the same we have we try to respect the human rights and the morality, but in the same time we have to think about what you presented, Doctor, about the phase of development of a lot of countries. And we have to take care, because even in EU we can speak, if we are not carefully with what we are doing, we can arrive to transport poverty, energy poverty, water poverty, which is not in the light of our discussion, yeah, people-led partnership. We have to think about people first, and then about the rest. For the rest, you spoke also about energy, and energy is very important for the future, especially now when we want to give rid of fossil fuel, and we have to use sustainable sources. Solar is okay, wind is okay, but it's not enough. And especially in Caribbean, I don't see, it's my personal opinion, I don't see other way than nuclear energy. SMRs, the new technologies are very advanced, very good. United States is in the lead right now, but EU is coming, and we shall have some programs in EU regarding the small modular reactors. And this is, in my opinion, the future, because with sun and wind will not be enough to provide the energy necessary to apply all the measures. Second is, in my opinion, education is very important, because you need people, you need new skills, and you need people to understand what is going on, and also to promote the development of small and medium enterprises in order to provide some possibility for revenues for the people. So we have a lot of things that we can discuss in this assembly to exchange best practices and to try to help each other in order to face these challenges that will be very critical in the next future. And to finish with something maybe special, I hope that we shall not become a green museum. Again, we need to develop in the same time jobs. So to reduce emissions, but in the same time to keep the jobs for the people, because otherwise I don't think that it will be good for all of us. Thank you very much for this possibility to have this intervention.
Honorable Barry Griffin, Bahamas.
Good morning, members. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Doctor. We just have one comment and a quick question. So island nations like the Bahamas, we are at the forefront of climate change, from rising oceans and natural disasters, but we are also trying to be at the forefront of innovative solutions to combat climate change and in climate resilience. On the part of the Bahamas last year, our Prime Minister launched the Bahamas Sustainable Investment Program, which is an investment program intended to accelerate investment in climate resilience and equitable sustainable development by creating a blended finance facility for the private sector to invest in, to plug the gaps in ready-to-go projects in climate resilience. We are targeting traditional institutional investors as well as non-traditional investors such as credit unions, members of the Caribbean diaspora, regional and international financial firms. On our part, our question is, from where you sit, what is it that countries like the Bahamas, who, like I said, are at the forefront of climate change, can do to ensure that innovative programs and strategies like the ones we are pushing to the world are invested in by the actors that need to invest? So the institutional, the non-traditional investors within the European Union, regionally, what are strategies that we can use, and what assistance is there that we can hope to attain to ensure that we're able to plug the gap in climate finance? Thank you.
Mr. Hyde.
Thank you, Chair, and my thanks to the keynote speaker. And I want to draw the attention first to the fact that it is an historic dimension what happened in this assembly with the formal adoption of our rules of procedure. And I want to apologize that it took 2 years to ratify the agreement, because the Samoa agreement for me needs means opportunity. It will be the opportunity for a new level of partnership and cooperation. And we should use the momentum to act and to go forward on eye level. And there are a lot of challenges. Also, this is historic. And I also want to start with climate change. And I want to stress we are talking about planet Earth, and in fact, it's planet ocean. And when we talk to our colleagues from the Caribbean and with the colleagues from the Pacific, we have to be aware of this. And I don't see what our co-chair has said, the situation that there is only one opportunity for the Caribbean island, this is nuclear power, and I strongly condemn this view, because I'm coming from a country, in our constitution, we have the regulations that there is no longer a use of nuclear power, and we are working hard on energy efficiency, and there are many companies in Austria, and there are many companies in whole of Europe that are able to bring energy efficiency to the Caribbean as well as the Pacific. And I share the view of our keynote speaker that it's very hard for European SMEs to go to the markets in the Caribbean and to go to the markets in the Pacific. And if there is one task for the European Union side, then we have to do everything to open the opportunity for our companies to go there and to install all this technology. And I'm very sorry, I so often hear Europe can't do and we are not able. I want to have a Europe that is able and that is acting, that has perspectives and gives its perspectives to our partnership countries in the Caribbean as well in the Pacific and well in Africa. And this is our task. This is what we have to do. We have to bring energy efficiency to these countries, and there's so much of opportunity. And please do not make us a fossil museum, a museum of fossil energies in Europe, an open air museum. Take the opportunity and make a Europe that is able to take challenges and is looking forward and thinking forward and is not satisfied with what it is. Because any civilization that said we cannot change anything abolished itself. So let us go forward together. And one point I also want to stress is strengthening the civil society. We have women's and youth forums now in the new rules of procedure as institutionalized, and this should be the base of socio-economic initiatives. Don't forget education, don't forget culture and the possibilities of sport, especially in a society where we are confronted in Europe with xenophobic, racist and discriminatory views. This could be a very good fundament to counter all these developments even within Europe. And I also want to mention we have doubters of the climate change in Europe. And when we talk to our colleagues, especially from the Caribbean, then this makes us aware how present this development is and how we need to act, and we need to act immediately. So I'm looking forward to our partnership, to an eye-level partnership, and I'm convinced that the new Samoa Agreement gives us the fundament and the best base for this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Lucia Duris.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to focus more on the essential role of NGOs and the public representatives in the fulfillment of Samoa Agreement. I remember our meeting with Pacific Islands representatives that was held in November last year in Solomon Islands, Honiara. And this was shortly before we signed the Samoa Agreement. And together with the official authorities from the Pacific Islands, we discussed many relevant topics from the Cotonou Agreement, starting with women's rights and to climate changes. And I come from Slovakia. This is a small country in the very heart of Europe. And unfortunately, my country is mostly hit by disinformation and hoax, massive campaigns that are financed by China and Russia. And this massive disinformation campaigns have basically two main goals recently: to convince people in Europe that there is nothing like Russian aggression in Ukraine. And the second big goal is to convince the Europeans that there is nothing like climate change. And you would be surprised how many people in Europe believe this. And I remember in Honiara, the official representatives from Pacific Islands being shocked that there is someone in well-educated Europe who still has doubts about climate changes, because it is them and it is you from the Caribbean and Pacific part of the world that face the nature disasters caused by climate change day by day, to the point that some of the islands are shrinking or do not exist anymore. And I was, and I still am, very surprised by the enormous cooperation between OSCP's countries and China, as China is one of the biggest polluters in the world that is ruining our planet. So for me, this is quite a paradox, and I have to say, sadly, that it often is the result of the EU restrictions and regulations. Anyway, I remember from Honiara that the most enthusiastic voice that was present at that time, that was advocating for minorities, for the vulnerable ones, for our planet, for the future of the world, was the voice of the youth from NGOs, from civil society organizations that were present at that meeting. And the voice was not only passionate when talking about the biggest challenges of today's world, but also very critical about political actions and the poor delivery of most of the political commitments in the original Cotonou Agreement. And one of the critical points referred to the fact that we treat the public sector and the NGOs as service providers and not our partners in the governance action. The Samoa Agreement includes many formal elements that refer to the importance of NGOs in democracy and governance, peace and security, human rights, climate change, etc., mostly in Article 95, but the place of civil society is not clearly defined at the institutional level. This is left to the OSCPs and EU institutions. And here I can see that this might be very tricky and challenging, because despite of all of our formal promises, the space for NGOs is shrinking in many ACP countries, but also in EU member states. And it is very true when it comes to my country, Slovakia, for instance, because it is the NGOs who fight against the massive disinformation campaigns that are spread around Europe and financed by China and Russia. So I would be very happy if we could not only formally with the big words, but also in reality start to cooperate with the civil society sector and the NGOs and make them equal partners to us and accompany the work of civil society organizations in parallel with the OSCPs and EU meetings. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Hero Clark, Jamaica. As representative entrusted with shaping the future of our region, we bear a profound responsibility to address the pressing challenges posed by climate change. The Caribbean region is on the front line of equitable climate financing mechanism, facing increasingly frequent and severe hurricanes, rising sea levels, and other extreme weather events. These threats not only endanger lives and livelihood, but also exacerbate existing vulnerability and inequality within our society. In this context, the need for a robust and equitable climate financing mechanism cannot be overstated. However, traditional approaches to climate financing have often fallen short, failing to adequately address the unique needs and priorities of our region. Too often, decisions about resources allocation are made without meaningful input from the communities most affected by climate change. This is why I advocate for a people-led partnership in our approach to climate financing. Such an approach prioritizes the voice and concerns of our communities, ensuring that their need guides the decision-making process. It empowers local stakeholders, including indigenous people, small-scale farmers, and vulnerable coastal communities to actively participate in the design, implementation, and monitoring of climate financing activities. Moreover, a people-led partnership perspective fosters greater accountability and transparency in helping to build trust between government, civil society, and international partners by promoting inclusive and participatory decision-making procedures that can ensure that climate financing reaches those who need it most and supports initiatives that are both effective and sustainable in long term. Furthermore, the Caribbean EU Regional Parliamentary Assembly has a crucial role to play in advocating the mobilization of additional resources for climate financing and promoting policies that promote resilience and adaptation by working together across national boundaries and political divide. We can amplify our collective voices and drive a meaningful action of the global stage. In concluding, the challenges posed by climate change requires bold and visionary leadership. By embracing a people-led partnership perspective within the Caribbean EU Regional Parliamentary Assembly, we can chart a course towards a more sustainable and resilient future for our region. Let us seize this opportunity to stand in solidarity with our communities, protect our planet, and ensure a brighter tomorrow for generations to come. Mr. Ignacio, Doctor. Oh, let's take Doctor on these questions that were raised and concerns.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clark. Thank you for these excellent points, which I will seek to just provide some input on. Unfortunately, I will need to drop off the line in about 5 minutes' time. So my apologies if there are additional points, but would be happy to be in touch with any colleagues on the floor if they see the need to share. The first point, in terms of the energy and poverty nexus, I think it's absolutely critical that we understand, as I mentioned earlier, that there should be no bifurcation, right, between climate change and poverty. Energy, as mentioned by the president of the session, I would agree with the colleague from Austria that there perhaps isn't a need to see nuclear energy as the only solution in the Caribbean. Caribbean islands, depending on which ones we're talking about, have a range of resources. Certainly, Caribbean islands do not have the abundant hydro resources that many of our colleagues and counterparts in Africa have. However, many do have geothermal. Geothermal exists in St. Vincent, it exists in Dominica, it exists in St. Lucia, and that is a very potentially powerful baseload power resource. There is a challenge in that our grids are not interconnected, and therefore it is difficult to share power that is intermittent. That power comes from solar or it comes from wind, and therefore being able to share the power across the grid is a challenge. However, using battery storage, and in some cases using hydrogen fuel or fuel cells, it is absolutely possible to power certainly the smaller islands entirely through renewable energy. Many countries, if not all, have developed renewable energy strategies that seek to install between 50 and 100% of renewables between 2030, 2035, 2040, 2050, depending on the individual country's targets. And those renewable energy strategies have looked in great detail at the resources that are available, the combination of base load and peaking power, and the need for battery storage. And I understand that in most, if not all cases, those plans have outlined what will happen in the renewable space. So I would support the comment from Austria that perhaps we don't need to lock ourselves into an individual technology, be that nuclear or anything else, and to look at the energy plans of countries to see what those governments have already stated will be their priorities. I fully agree that the point on energy efficiency is critical in far too many countries around the world, and not just in ACP countries. But here, I'm in the United States at the moment, there is a terrible level of energy efficiency. We are replacing power on the grid with power that we are losing because our windows are not insulated, because we are using old appliances. And this is where actually I would argue that for the European Union, ensuring that the highest quality appliances are exported, particularly in countries where the grid is seriously constrained at the moment, would be perhaps the best solution. So fully agree that energy efficiency is critical. But I would also argue that in many islands, and here I will take as an example Barbados, there are innovative technologies that have been homegrown and have been developed in country and are being produced in country, and supporting the scale up of those homegrown solutions is perhaps worth considering. For example, in Barbados, most homes have solar water heaters that use the ample energy from the sun to heat water for showers, for other warm water purposes. And that is far more efficient than using geysers or other electrical technologies to heat water. So all of that to say, and you might have gathered that I have a background in energy systems, let's think carefully about the energy solutions. Let's look at homegrown options, and let's look at how we bring those to scale. Which brings me to the comment from a colleague from the Bahamas. Thank you very much indeed for sharing that Bahamas is looking at blended finance. That is an absolutely critical area that is being promoted under the Bridgetown Initiative, but also given my background in finance, is an area that needs to be looked at far more. Blended finance, for those who perhaps are not familiar, uses a combination of resources, be it concessional resources combined with commercial resources, be that guarantees. Green guarantees are one example, be that viability gap financing. It's a range of instruments that allow the necessary financing from the private sector to come to the table. The colleague asked, what will it take? Are there examples of how this has been done before, and how does the Bahamas make their program successful? I would argue that the starting point would be to have a comprehensive and robust investment plan for the country. And that investment plan should outline what is it across all key sectors that the government, as a starting point, is committing to seeing be successful over the coming 5, 10, 15 years. So what in the energy space? What in the housing space, what in the infrastructure space, what in the coastal protection space, what in the social upliftment space and economic growth space is the government committing to? What are the major programs? What are the major initiatives that the government will do the needful in order to make happen? And once you understand what the medium to long-term strategy is of the government and therefore of the country, being very granular about what needs to be done by the public versus private versus social sector. That segmentation is critical. And unfortunately, often when segmentation is done, what ends up happening is that governments say, well, we can't afford to do this, so the private sector must do it. The private sector will not do things because they're not affordable by the government. The private sector will do things where there's a return, where there is revenue generation and a return on investment, and therefore a profit, and where there are the correct incentives and legal and regulatory frameworks. And this is where, again, speaking to parliamentarians, your role is critical. So making sure that you have a robust and comprehensive investment plan that segments across all sectors, but also segments across the business models. There will be business models in the Bahamas, as there are elsewhere in the world, that are not going to be financially viable. They may be economically viable in that investing in education will benefit the country and the economy over time, but over the short term, it may not be financially viable. Whereas investing in medium income housing or investing in renewable energy or investing in upgrades to your water network, and I know the Bahamas has done a lot of work on water loss reduction, may generate revenues that would attract the private sector. And then the third step is, what is the necessary blended finance in order to ensure that the private investment comes to the table, right? And that blended finance, for example, you talked about philanthropy. It may be that you need early stage venture investment in blue economy as a sector, right? In developing new products from the seas, in using sargassum to produce, innovative biomedicines. So what are the types of catalytic investments that are necessary? It could be from philanthropists, it could be from guarantees that will protect an investor in case there is a loss, provided that that investor is also putting skin in the game. So I'd be very happy to have a much longer conversation with you on this, just to share that we have just completed, and I have led the completion of an investment plan for Barbados, a similar climate resilience and recovery plan for Dominica some years ago, and many countries around the world, particularly under the V20 leadership, are looking at climate prosperity plans that will help countries do exactly what it is that the Bahamas is trying to do. Just quickly on a couple of additional critical and very, very much underrated across many countries in the world. Again, this is not just across the ACP, but the reality is that in countries with young populations who need a future, who need jobs, well-paying jobs, attractive jobs, interesting jobs that use their skills. If we look at the countries of the Caribbean, but also, again, other countries around the world, we are training incredibly highly skilled, talented young people to do things that are exciting for them, and yet we do not have the opportunities in our country. So making sure that we understand how to close that gap is critical. Otherwise, I believe that ACP countries will have a huge brain drain, which has been happening for many, many years, but will continue to accelerate as the opportunities diminish in our smaller economies and develop, be this artificial intelligence, be this biotechnology in northern countries. And that's something that we absolutely need to get our hands on, because the resources, the intellect of our young people are perhaps our strongest resource. And then finally, from the colleague from Jamaica, in terms of people-led partnerships and inclusion, I could not agree more. I would just add one additional point, which is data. Not enough data is used to make decisions about not only, where to invest money, but how to build and where we should be putting certain infrastructure resources, be that schools or clinics, be that new roads or decentralized energy infrastructure. Data for decision-making, both on the needs of the population, but on the flip side, on the areas that are most likely to be impacted by climate change. On the coast and on the inland, where are we going to experience greater landslides? Where is there greater risk of flooding on the coastline? All of this can be measured and visualized using data. Again, giving the example of Barbados, that is something that we've developed. And I know that Jamaica has done a lot of work over the past maybe 2 years on data-informed decision-making. But making sure that that trickles through all areas of the economy is key, right? Data is not just there to sit, in a cloud server. It is for decision-making. So I would strongly encourage the colleague from Jamaica to look at the excellent data that's already been pulled together on climate change, but see if it's possible to incorporate data on social protection, data on the needs, from a socioeconomic perspective into that climate change data set, so that your decision-making is truly holistic. It addresses the socioeconomic aspects from poverty to economic growth and jobs, as well as the downside data, risk management in terms of climate change. So I realize I've gone well over the 5 minutes that I promised. I have young children upstairs, so please excuse me as I will have to sign off. If there are any burning questions, please do feel free to channel them to me. And otherwise, I thank you greatly for the opportunity to be here and for the excellent interventions that I've had the privilege of listening to.
Thank you, Doctor. We do appreciate your time. At this time, we will continue with the debate. So other members who have burning concerns and questions, you will place them, and then we will make sure that an answer gets to you. We continue with Coral Trench, Honorable Caroline Trench, sorry, Belize.
Good, I think it's still morning. No, good afternoon. It's after 12, yes. Belize has a national climate finance strategy, and within it we have 3 specific objectives. One is to provide an integrated and strategic approach to access resources required towards enhancing climate resilience and climate change mitigation. The second is to enhance national capacities to mobilize and utilize resources required for priority climate actions. And the third is to maximize synergies with other sectorial development plans and sustainable development co-benefits of climate investments. So we do recognize, as the speaker said, the interlinkages between poverty, sustainable development, and climate change. So my question then becomes, how can SIDS, for which Belize is a member, Belize is considered a SIDS, overcome the gap between what is considered climate finance and financing what is also considered pre-existing development problems, one of which is poverty? I pose the question within the context of the issues that were laid out, particularly issues of debt. If we are to talk about accessing and scaling up climate finance, one has to look at how climate finance is defined and is accessed. It focuses, as far as it is understood, on the cost of upgrading or strengthening systems, infrastructure, social systems, and so on and so forth, to deal with the added impact or increased intensity, frequency of flooding, rainfall, storm systems, and so on and so forth. But what that assumes is that there is something that exists to strengthen. The reality is that in many SIDS, particularly in urban communities, which is receiving, to some extent, the ongoing demographic shifts, more people are moving in urban areas. The infrastructure, whether it's the physical infrastructure, roads, water systems, energy supply, the social protection systems, they are either inadequate, they may be non-existent, and to a large extent, the physical infrastructure like roadways and drainage, they are aging. There's some key or significant features of urban communities in SIDS, like informal settlements, which really have absolutely no type of services and so on and so forth to upgrade. So the question then comes back to, if we're focused on poverty, sustainable development, and climate change, and climate finance is only focusing on what is added, how do we address that gap between strengthening what is not there, providing what is not there, to have something to upgrade and to strengthen? So that is my contribution.
Thank you. Mr. Ignacio.
Here. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and distinguished colleagues from the European Parliament and the delegates from the Caribbean. Today, as we engage in a crucial dialogue on climate finance within the Caribbean and European Union Regional Parliamentary Assembly, we found ourselves at a crossroads. The urgency to act on climate change has never been more pressing, and the need for robust, equitable finance mechanisms has never been clearer. Developed nations have pledged to support developing countries in their fight against climate change, committing to significant financial assistance for mitigation, adaptation, and addressing loss and damage. Yet, as we stand in 2024, these promises remain largely unfulfilled, with a notable shortfall of the annual $100 billion target. This gap not only hinders progress, but places an undue burden on those least responsible for climate change, our partners in the Global South, especially the Caribbean states, small island developing states, whose very existence is threatened by rising sea levels and extreme weather events. The Caribbean region, rich in culture and biodiversity, faces unparalleled challenges. The adverse impacts of climate change exacerbate existing vulnerabilities, making the call for accessible, adequate, and fair climate finance not just a matter of policies, but a moral imperative. We must address the structural issues within current finance mechanisms where loans dominate over grants, pushing countries further into debt, and where a disproportionate focus on middle-income countries leaves the most vulnerable behind. The European Union, as a global leader in climate action, must take a proactive stance. First, we need to ensure that our financial commitments are met, and then we should try to exceed our expectations. We must advocate for grants over loans, especially for adaptation and loss and damage financing, to prevent further indebtedness of climate-vulnerable countries. Furthermore, the path towards a resilient, sustainable future requires innovative financing solutions. These include leveraging green bonds, enhancing the role of the Green Climate Fund, and exploring debt for climate swaps, ensuring that these mechanisms prioritize the needs and voices of states. To this extent, I agree with what colleagues Aida was saying about the using of nuclear in the region. I also come from a country, Italy, that rejected that technology through a couple of referendums where Italian people decided not to use a technology that we consider extremely dangerous and expensive, while we think that investments in renewable energies would be better. In conclusion, let our discussion today reaffirm our commitment to a people-led partnership that places equity at the heart of climate finance. Together, we can build a framework that supports the Caribbean and other vulnerable regions in transitioning to a sustainable future, ensuring that no one is left behind in our collective fight against climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Grenada.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, Mr. Co-President, to both of you. A pleasant good afternoon, and congratulations to all as we have formally entered into this new relationship. I express the desire that this relationship be far more productive than the previous one, both in terms of timing and with our new emphasis on people-centered partnership. I desire that, and I am clear that Grenada will work for that. My thanks to all the organizers, and particularly to the Barbadian young lady who's gone off to take care of her children, for the excellent summation of the Bridgetown initiative. Every time we hear it, we learn something new from it, so I think it's good for the Barbadians to keep presenting it. Mr. Chair, take the view of one of the speakers that I think it's our expert presenter, that we cannot separate the natural nexus between poverty alleviation, climate change, and other structural or episodic challenges that we might face. It's one fabric. You know, we could think of one of the popular Angolan cloths, the one with the red, black, and white. You know, it's all there. You cannot take away the black from the red, from the white. All together, they make the Angolan fabric. And I think thus it is with what we are trying to do. We have to compartmentalize it to get at it. So we speak about climate finance. But climate finance, despite the distinction we are forced to make between climate finance and development financing, it, in the end, the people in the budget offices will tell you, if not in the project office, certainly in the budget office, they tell you, you know, just get it in, get the resources in, and we will figure out how to allocate it. So that's one reality. And the other one is, which, to repeat myself here, on the question of people-centered. If that is the new motto, we have to live it. It's not a campaign slogan, right? So therefore, I think I go back in October of last year, there was a high-level dialogue on climate change held in Grenada, passing the baton from Bahamas in preparation for COP28. And the outcomes are online. We can read them.
Recording in progress.
One of the main positions that came out, it was a summit. I think we had about 6 Caribbean heads of government, and they said simply, as we prepare for COP28, we have one message for Bonn. Write the check. Write the check. That's the message that I'm bringing here. We understand, so now we need the resources to flow greater, faster, more directly. And therefore, the first proposal I have this morning is the meeting that will be held in Antigua and Barbuda in 3 months on SIDS, the 4th International Conference on SIDS, has as one of its priority climate finance. And I think the European Union will be active in that meeting. And perhaps you might go there with the intention to turn a new leaf around the notion of people-centered partnership. I can say specifically, for example, we want endorsement of the multivariable index, MVI. If the MVI becomes an operational tool in the development financing arena, it can help the climate financing. So the MVI is a good place to start at the conference in Antigua and Barbuda in April. Secondly, the Caribbean, as you know, it's like Europe, many layers. The OECS, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, is fairly small, highly successful. And the OECS has put out a program of climate, of sustainable development. In Grenada, our version of it is something we are now calling the Vision 2075, which was launched about 2 weeks ago, as we celebrated our 50th anniversary of independence. Vision 75 focuses on about 5 main pillars. And I am proposing that these be used as models for the startup, because this EU Caribbean General Assembly and partnership, it's a startup, it's an institutional startup, you know, away from what was spoken about, the reform of international, you know, IFIs and so on. So we focus first and foremost on health. We want a climate financing that focuses on health, moves to education, moves thirdly to energy, moves fourthly to infrastructure, including, innovation, ICTs and so on, and continues in other thematic areas. But those 4 key sectors, integrated as they are as part of our SDG agenda, really help us address the potential, the mitigation, but also the adaptation issues of climate and the need for financing. My third recommendation, my third pillar for this new people-centered partnership is inclusion and equity, focusing on gender, youth, rural, disenfranchised. Those are the constituencies that need to see that this partnership is for them as people. It's not for the bureaucrats, the intellectuals, the political elites. We are the people who have been in the game. Now, if we are in a new era, if we are committed to a new era, those are the constituencies that need to be accounted for. And lastly, and related to the other one, I want us to focus in climate financing on SMEs. Since I arrived here a few days ago, I've been asking, well, because I confess, I did not read the Samoa agreement in its entirety. My colleagues, my officers in Brussels keep summarizing parts of it to me. So one day on the beach in Grenada or Belize, so I will take it and read it. But I think that the question that jumps out at me is, in this new agreement, can we write the check? And for whom? So we want the check for this SMEs, the small, medium-sized enterprises. The gaps that we have can actually begin to be overcome if we invert the model. Large sums going to smaller places. Because what we have had is large sums going to the top of the economy, and we wait for the trickle down. I want to suggest, again, somebody spoke about NGOs and people-centered, put the resources in the hands of the people-centered structures of society, which in this case is the small and medium-sized enterprises. I end with this for now, and I thank you for your indulgence of an air.
Thank you very much. We have some other speakers. We are going to ask you to be as concise as possible, as we are now pressing for time. Mr. Leopold Lopez.
Thank you, Co-Chair. I will try to be very, very to the point. It is obvious that we have come some way from the Cotonou agreement to the Samoa agreement. Europe has enjoyed very, I would say, progressive economic exchange with the Caribbean. I will give you some figures. We're close to almost 40 billion euros in a commercial exchange between the Caribbean and the European Union. Exports from the Caribbean, from the Union to the Caribbean, are close to 25 billion euros now. And imports from the Caribbean to the Union are close to 15 billion. The main products, of course, coming from Europe to the Caribbean are machinery, chemicals, and vehicles. And then the exports from the Caribbean are basically agricultural products and mineral products, including petroleum. We are quite aware that economic progress means in many ways a cost as well. Mainly the cost of climate change, I would say. And we have heard enough about the problem and maybe some of the suggestions for solutions. But there are also other problems that we have not heard this morning associated with the increment of exchanges. I would mention drug trafficking, money laundering, and a very important issue, immigration. There are over 2.5 million Caribbean origin inhabitants or residents in Europe. Quite a figure for small countries, because they're basically smaller countries that compound the Caribbean unit. What we worry about, and we should worry about, on the point of view of climate change, it's basically not from a humanitarian point of view, but rather from what it means to the loss of human rights for the people who suffer climate change disasters or disaster originated by climate change induced by human beings. It is obvious that human rights to safety of food, safety of health, education, and even housing are all in danger. And we have very poor populations in the Caribbean that are unfortunately, not only because they're already a very poor nation, and I'm speaking about countries like Haiti and Cuba, where 80% or more of the families are under the poverty line, can encounter natural disasters. It is impossible for them. So I think that we should look into new ways of dealing with this problem, not only through the education and changing, and I agree with my colleague from Grenada, that we should also look at the smaller units of production, because it's the only way to develop a normal way of exploiting economically, but also assuring that climate change will be respected in those countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Karsten.
No. No. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. So I can also be very brief here, but I would like to strengthen some things that were mentioned already in this debate. So when you open papers and reports about EU-Caribbean relations, you find like descriptions: biggest investors, third biggest trading partner, biggest partner in development cooperation, all this. I don't know whether they're true, but they sometimes are used just to describe something like we've done our job already, and I think this is not true. So we have really to cross-check reality and see where we really need to re-establish also our strategic traditional partnership to make it really a long-lasting partnership. And many colleagues here mentioned the different items we need to work on, and also I can add that strengthening trade relations, and especially from our side, also global gateway investment strategy, especially on fair and green transition, would be very concrete items where we can really move forward. But also security issues, also internally into our societies, also connected to cross-border crime, climate change and all the consequences that was named today, but also the labor market that was talked about, especially also for the younger generation, because we can open all the books and talk about all the problems. It all starts with a real decent life for our citizens. If we are managing to do this, this is really the ground basis really to do something. And I think also for now, sitting here in this parliamentary assembly, we don't need to underestimate the parliamentary democracy as a really sharp sword, and really we need to promote this issue to go forward, and don't let it even go to governments, but also to parliaments. And then if you put it further down, I totally agree what was said with NGOs and civil society, because very often, if you look back in history, change comes from the bottom and not from the top. So this is something we really need to consider in our future work. And also I think we need to be really pragmatic, and this is kind of the distinction, and there's also the talk of double standards. On the one hand, of course, we don't need to forget about our common DNA, which is human rights, democracy, rule of law, all these issues. But on the other hand, we have to be pragmatic in the problems that are at hand right now and try to give them really a very good solution. So to maneuver between those two pillars, I think this is the way forward for us together. And in the end, we have shared political challenges. We haven't talked about populism and polarization in our societies. I think this is something we also share. Also inequality, poverty. This is not something that only touches the Caribbean region, but also the European Union is, and the member states are touched by these issues. So, and this could be really threats for democracy as a whole. And if we talk now of a new dawn and a political lead partnership, I think these are really big words, but in the end it's us. We are the ones who do implement it and really do the investment, and I think in the very end we need real economic and political investment to do really a step forward here. And for this, and I don't know whether I heard it today, but we have a